Good morning from Berlin. Good morning in Europe. Good afternoon to friends and colleagues further east. Welcome to this virtual MERICS event. My name is Bernhard Bartsch. I'm the Director for External Relations at MERICS, and I'll steer us through this next hour in which we want to offer you and to discuss with you our analysis of recent developments in China. We have titled this session, as you know, The Return of Uncertainty, and we want to ask ourselves, and we want to ask you, whether the multiple crises that China is facing currently actually add up to a perfect storm. That's the metaphor that we're starting this hour with, and at the end of the hour, obviously, we will hope to either have the question mark removed or have come up with a better metaphor for the situation that we are facing. Many of you joined us in January for our annual forecast event, where experts discussed that maintaining stability would be the core challenge for the Chinese leadership in 2022. That has come to be very true, although many of us probably didn't expect just how many challenges China would be facing this year. We have seen COVID-19 lockdowns in several cities and provinces. We have a sharp decline in the economy. We have external pressure, not least because of China's alignment with Russia in the Ukraine war. And of course, we have internal stress that we at least sense in this also important year ahead of the party congress at the end of the year. So how serious is all of this for China's leadership and for Xi Jinping in particular, who, as we all know, is seeking to extend his rule at the end of the year at the party congress for another 5 years or probably indefinitely? That's what we will discuss this morning with three MERICS experts. Miko Hotari, our executive director, will kick us off with an input on China's economic trajectory. Ms. Grünberg, who is our lead analyst in our politics and society team, will then give us the perspective on the internal developments in the system. And Helena Ligada, our lead analyst for foreign relations and security policy, will look at the global environment. Before we start, two more things to do. First, housekeeping rules. This is a public event. It is being recorded, so please be aware of that. If you have questions, if you have comments, please put them in the chat. And for the discussion later on, we'll take questions from there. The same goes for any technical questions that you may have. Second thing, before we begin, we want to take a short survey of everyone present here this morning, knowing that we're of course speaking here with an expert community and your take on these developments is just as valuable as ours. So if you are using the Teams app, you should see a survey popping up on your screen pretty much now, or you can go to the chat and should see the questions there, or some of you will have the survey button, but one way or another, you should hopefully have a survey with a couple of questions. Let me see whether I can see it. Here it is. And I hope you see it. And if you don't, this is your chance of a 2-minute internship of living in a system where for some unfair reason other people can vote and you cannot. The first question is, how strong do you expect China's economy to grow in 2022? I know we have some macroeconomists here who will have a very professional opinion on this. For others, it's more a proxy question for how much do you trust the Chinese leadership to be able to deliver on its set goals. So how strong do you expect the China's economy to grow in 2022? The three options are around 5.5%, which is the official growth target. Second option, 4.4%, which is the latest IMF revised expectation, or below 4.4%. Please click now. As you see, we haven't added more than 5.5%. If you think that is actually a reasonable expectation, do feel free to make a point for that in the chat. And if you look at the chat, you should also see the results there. And the large majority here, more than 50%, actually expect China to grow below 4.4%. And only 6% of you expect China to fulfill the goals that it set at the National People's Congress in March of 5.5%. Let's go to the second question. The second question refers back to our title. How serious are the current challenges for Xi Jinping, for his political ambitions at the 20th Party Congress? We chose the metaphor perfect storm with a question mark. Do you actually think this is a perfect storm for the Chinese system? Or is it just a strong headwind? Or is it even less than that, a brief turbulence? Please make your selection now. And we see answers in the chat coming up. And we have about a 2/3 majority for strong headwind. Very few colleagues here would agree with the perfect storm metaphor. And about 1/4 would see this as a brief turbulence. So quite serious in any case. Last question. That will refer to what all of this means for us in Europe. Refers to our possible responses and our political trajectory with China and our China policy. The EU, as you all know, sees China as a partner, competitor, and rival. And our question to you is, which element should currently be on top of the political agenda of European policymakers? Should it be the partnership element? Should it be the competition, the economic competition element, or should it be systemic rivalry, or none of the three, because you think all three elements should get equal attention? Do take your pick, and I see that many of you have done so. And about 1/3 answer that all elements should get equal attention. And that's what the tripartite approach of the EU actually says. It's all simultaneous, but actually 1/3 always would put rivalry on top, and only 5% currently think that partnership should be the top priority. Again, an interesting result, definitely a result that would have been quite different, I would guess, a year or 2 years ago. And having said that, I'll hand over to our experts. Miko Hotari will kick us off, and the screen is yours.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Bernhard, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. I will lead off with a few thoughts on the economic picture mostly. And we wanted to get started with the picture of the lockdowns and the COVID numbers that you hear and see in China at the moment. As you see, you could argue that the worst is behind China. New COVID cases are actually at their lowest since the beginning of March. You see the figures here, specifically for also the death rate, which has come down very fast. So if you wish a relative success of, again, extremely harsh lockdown measures, specifically in Shanghai over the past 2 months. So if you look at it more in detail, it becomes clear that the story is not completely over. Yes, the outbreaks in Shanghai and in Beijing are slowly back under control. But if you look at the growth numbers and for new cases across the country on the right side, you continue to see quite a few provinces with pretty high growth rates, and we still look at a future of new outbreaks, rolling lockdowns, clearly as a continuous, at least looming risk. What's important to us to highlight here is that the economic stress that the Chinese system is experiencing at the moment is not just a function of the COVID lockdowns. It is in many ways a much wider crisis of confidence. It is also quite clear that we are not looking at a V-shaped recovery similar to the one that China has experienced in 2020. So if you look at what traditionally would be defined as a perfect storm, a bad situation caused by a combination of unfavorable circumstances, clearly we have a perfect storm. Now, the extent to which that leads to a systemic crisis, I think, is extremely contestable, and we would probably all argue here as speakers that this is not a likely outcome. But let's go through the details a bit more in the coming minutes. So the economic downward pressure domestically is clearly related to the COVID resurgence and lockdowns, but it's also a function of the property sector downturn. It is a function of uncertain policy direction. There's exchange rate pressure, capital outflows that have more to do with global factors. There's a slump in global demand, growing inflation, as for many other countries, supply chain disruptions that are creating stress also for the Chinese system. There's the monetary policy by advanced economies that changes the global outlook. Plus, as colleagues will look at more in detail, internal political pressure. There's limits for what is possible in terms of policy change as we are heading towards the 20th Party Congress. And as my colleague Nies will outline later, the boundaries for what is legitimate in terms of policy correction at the moment are quite strict and limited. We're also looking at continuous geopolitical tensions, the war in the Ukraine, obviously continued US-China conflict, heightened even probably over the past weeks, pressure on human rights questions, etc. But if I stay with the economic picture here for a moment, April data was definitely a shock for the leadership and everyone looking at China. If you look at data points across all sectors, across the industries, factory production was down, manufacturing, retail sales. Two particularly hard hit regions, the Northeast, Yangtze River Delta, have seen minus 14 or minus 16% of industrial output. That's all year-on-year comparison. And then if you look at sectors that have where we have a particular German, if not European interest, passenger car production and auto sales, for instance, being dramatically decreased in April, again, year-on-year figures. And it's quite clear the story of April is not just April, it's not over. We have an anemic recovery in May. Now, obviously, the lockdown situation will improve, but the fact that lockdowns have been formally lifted does not mean that production and logistics are back on track fully. So it's quite clear that the outlook, and that's the reason why observers continue to revise projections over the past weeks, is deteriorating even further. Li Keqiang, against that backdrop, has said just a few days ago that China's economy to some degree is in a worse position than early 2020, and obviously that means a lot. The key struggle at the moment is to get the second quarter positive growth, if not a recession. But the medium-term ambition obviously is to hold the line on 5.5% for 2022, which is an extremely ambitious goal. And we will see either dramatic measures to get to that goal with high costs in the long run, or a revision of that goal as we move forward. I want to point to one factor that is often underestimated by Western observers, at least. Jobs are absolutely key here. Nationwide unemployment, and I'll show you a chart here. That's in blue. Nationwide unemployment is up to 6.1%. That's surveyed unemployment, obviously. And even more worrying from a Chinese leadership perspective is clearly the youth unemployment, age 16 to 24. That's urban. It's not total. Unemployment is up to approaching 20%, which is quite significant. Now, what has been the response so far, and what shall we expect in the coming weeks and months? And I do hope that colleagues, by the way, see the slides, because I see a few comments here in the chat that the slides are not available. So I hope that works for everyone. If not, I would expect a note from colleagues to let me know. So we have not a whatever it takes response yet, but a very sustained, sophisticated, full-fledged crisis response, which will have quite far-reaching implications and long-term costs at the tail end of all of this. It's a pretty vast stimulus program that has been rolled out over the past 2-3 weeks. It's combined with an attempt to reassure the private sector and foreign companies in particular, starting in late April and May. But even a few weeks ago, you already saw the PBOC, the central bank, and the Ministry of Finance responding quite forcefully since mid-May with mortgage rates, reductions, VAT refund programs. And now on the 23rd of May, the State Council issuing a pretty comprehensive policy package that looks at, again, VAT refunds, reductions for car purchase tax, SME support measures, including a reduction of or suspension of the Social Security contributions, more incentives for local banks to lend to SMEs, and then the traditional package, if you wish, 300 billion railway construction bonds, instructions for local governments to use all of their infrastructure bond proceeds by end of August, which was meant to be spent by the end of the year. So you see a front loading of the stimulus packages that has been all rolled out anyway. You see new infrastructure projects, energy projects being rolled out. Now, where we are at the moment is clearly the central push moment in implementation. A pretty remarkable call last week, nationwide call with thousands of party officials by Li Keqiang on 25th of May, which is the surface really of a centralized push and control system that is meant to ensure implementation of these measures. Top-down instructions and guidelines will follow. It's already been announced that this will be accompanied by supervision and discipline visits, and you can expect cadres to respond to those incentives in a pretty tense political environment. So the 50-point Shanghai action plan will probably be followed by quite a few other local or provincial action plans that will implement those measures in overdrive. That's my expectation. The focus is deserved on livelihoods, it's jobs, food and energy security. We might expect some price controls. Again, that's in a sense standard package. And I would think that we still have significant room for maneuvering if the Chinese leadership decides to put additional gasoline into that stimulus program. More fiscal stimulus is feasible. Obviously, that would have far-reaching implications for central-local relations as we move forward. Risks are obvious for everyone who knows the Chinese system. Leverage in the system will be increased. It's to some extent the old stimulus package mechanism that is being rolled out, which creates threats to financial instability. And clearly, we are looking at a slower China in the medium term, a slower, most likely not sustainable growth outlook, and in what is clearly the case, a less predictable growth outlook for China. As we have little time, I will hand over immediately to my colleague Nies for a domestic politics outlook on all of this.
Thank you, Miko. So on the domestic political side, of course, the zero COVID approach and the fallout has over the past week or so led to quite some chatter on the more prominent role Li Keqiang in particular has filled, and the question of Xi being in trouble. So, just a couple of thoughts here on that first point. Xi has spent 10 years of eliminating alternative centers of power and rival factions. That includes not only corruption of Bo Xilai and Zhou Encarn and the likes, but also really weakened the factional setup that we were talking about 10 years ago of the Youth League and elites. So there's really only one kind of faction left at the Politburo level. That's Xi people. There's of course others but there's no meaningful faction or alternative centers that are distinguishable. I think the rumors also of Li Keqiang that have been discussed, he was in Yunnan without mask. He has been in charge of this call with over 100,000 cadres that Miko was alluding to before. Is quite speculative, and there's no hard evidence that he is making a splash also internally. But there's a very little hard evidence behind that. So I think we have to be careful of overreading the front page signals that are visible on People's Daily and elsewhere. I think it's also very important to, and Helena might say a word on this also, that she really has considerable control over the PLA and the vast security apparatus, which she of course has boosted significantly over the past years. He's also very much in charge of the CCP discipline apparatus, so he has also internal mechanisms, discipline, anti-corruption, and so on. So that's quite a big influence he has over overall cadres. So I think at this point, there's nothing short of a coup that really would be able to oust Xi at this point. Of course, there's a lot of discontent over the zero COVID and its fallout. And I think that should be taken serious. So the chaotic lockdowns really harm trust in local authorities. So at this at the interface level, local communities in Shanghai with the grid management authorities, with the community level authorities, the local party leaders, they have really taken a hit when it comes to the prestige and the belief of the people that there's a sensible management going on. Citizens, in lockdown cities have really been feeling how deep the authorities are willing to go and interfere, sometimes senselessly and really blindly with their lives. So that's of course a huge a damage to the trust that needs to be rebuilt. I think it's also inside the governance system, inside the authorities, there's a damage that has been done because there has been quite some disregard and ignorance towards health officials' warnings that that at some point we need to live with COVID, and it seems that China has been resting on the laurels after the first 2 years have been quite efficiently and quite effectively using zero COVID against other variants. This has now been tested, and it really has to be seen how on this map that we saw before. Are there other outbreaks in other cities? Do we see more chaotic responses as in Shanghai? I think that would really kind of deepen the rift and the damage inside the system and deepen the policy failure that really Beijing has to respond to now. There's of course no discussion of this really openly. There's lots of censorship going on. People, officials, health officials that are criticizing zero COVID are quickly sidelined, and I think it's quite critical to see over the next months how new outbreaks will be handled. I think the probably most explosive compound is among economic elites. So there's of course a lot of division, a lot of deep concern for where China is headed among private business owners, among the business elite. But really, in terms of how dangerous is it, these concerns have been there for quite a long time. And just last year, the past 2 years, we have seen a significant clampdown on private businesses and the tech business. So I'm not seeing the kind of coordinated opposition that would be necessary to really rock the boat at this point. Also, the stimulus measures that Miko talked about before are pretty much the playbook of supply side stimuli. So benefits will first and foremost go to in forms of tax rebates for companies and so on. So that might also keep things calm a little bit, and it really depends a lot on the next months, which will be under the star of harmony and stability. Next slide, please. So, with the stability mantra in mind, the 20th Party Congress will commence in late October, start November, somewhere around then. And up to then, really, stability is the key to understand what Beijing will do. And I think with Xi Jinping personally endorsing the zero COVID approach, or the dynamic clearing approach, as it's called now, there's no real reason to believe that Beijing will significantly change this approach also in future smaller outbreaks. I think it needs to be said also that Beijing is probably more concerned about a potential health crisis that would ensue unchecked COVID. There have been studies using modeling by Fudan University, among others, that unchecked COVID would lead to probably between 1.5 and 2 billion deaths and a pretty chaotic situation in the healthcare system. China has a very poor ICU system compared to other countries in terms of the amounts of ICU units that are available per citizen. So the health crisis that would ensue, and they had a taste of that in Wuhan 2 years ago, would probably be a bigger damage than economic downturn. That seems at least the thought in Beijing. I think also tough times are times for a tough leader, and faced with opposition in the past, that he really has been responding by doubling down on his control to prevent losing power. And I think his decision-making authority needs to come first. So I don't see any reason to believe that this will change and he will give in to alternative ideas up to the party Congress. So lastly, what are some factors that we are looking at that would actually signal some type of change or course correction? I think signs that the social contract, the belief in the social contract, systematically across society would be lost, especially among elites, especially among economic elites. That is something that the leadership is looking at. The kind of the trade of staying in power for general progress and continued opportunities for the elite. If that is failing systemically, I think that would be a very dangerous situation that would need to be addressed by some kind of correction. It might be include real demand side reforms or something like that. But this is something that we need to watch out for. I think evidence of leadership changes that would lead to a kind of a measurable discontinuation of the dominance of Xi allies in the next Politburo. That is something we, of course, only know probably after Beijing and after November, but that would indicate some kind of course correction. More people from groups that believe in a different economic model, in more opening, and so on. I think also the kind of a signal or a proxy signal would be the sustained absence going forward of Xi Jinping's legacy policy. So less mentions of common prosperity, less focus on party discipline and ideology, maybe a fewer mentions or iterations of Xi Jinping thought for whatever, and the different approaches to how to deal with inequality and so on. So Xi Jinping losing the dominance when it comes to framing the policy package and the priorities going forward, that would signal some type of course correction. So far, I don't see that happening, and the next couple of months really will show if this kind of not so perfect storm gathers critical mass and really actually can lead to some type of change.
All right, thank you, Nis, and good morning, everyone. Over the last few minutes of this presentation, I'm going to look at the international sphere of this perfect storm or potentially perfect storm. The first thing that has to be said is that the external pressures on the system are increasing. China's facing a number of global crises, much like many other countries. Its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, new revelations on what's going on in Xinjiang, the United States approach to the Indo-Pacific, and new policy initiatives on that front. It's creating an international environment that is increasingly challenging for Beijing. In particular, it's increasingly challenging Beijing's traditional approach to foreign policy and to a certain extent, China's position in the world even. We're looking at worsening public perceptions of China across multiple countries. We're looking at rising tensions with the West, of course, and we're looking at China having to publicly take a stance on crises like the war in Ukraine that are putting the Chinese leadership in a difficult position, having to choose to a certain extent between strategic goals and economic goals, and come out effectively in opposition to a long-standing principle of non-interference, for example. Tensions with the EU, the United States, and partners are rising, as I mentioned, as China is increasingly seen as a systemic rival, as we also saw during the survey that we did at the beginning of this presentation. And this, of course, carries economic, technological, and geopolitical risks and costs for the Chinese leadership. In terms of response, Beijing and Xi Jinping in particular is doubling down on geopolitical competition. What we are seeing is that geopolitical and ideological competition is increasingly becoming the main lens through which Beijing looks at international affairs. Quick note on this. This is not something that is particularly new. This is a process that has been ongoing for the last few years, and that is only being accelerated by the current sort of stacked up crises, as Xi Jinping calls them, that the leadership is facing. So Beijing is responding, as I said, by doubling down on geopolitical competition. We are seeing the Chinese leadership become increasingly concerned about an emerging US-led coalition of Western countries, allies, and partners that in the leadership side is being formed to contain China. And this applies to the Indo-Pacific. We're seeing more and more rhetoric coming out of Beijing about the US trying to create an Indo-Pacific version of NATO, which doesn't necessarily refer to NATO expanding to the Indo-Pacific, rather to the United States using its Indo-Pacific strategy to build a new grouping of countries that will have a military sort of angle to the partnership. And Beijing is responding in kind, quote unquote. The creation of blocs, despite Beijing's traditional dislike for coalitions and alliances, is become the new normal. The Chinese leadership is launching efforts to build a competing coalition or bloc of countries to push back against the emergence of this US-led grouping, and is targeting mostly countries in the global south. What we are seeing already, and we're likely to see more of in the future, is the leveraging of existing initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative and new initiatives like the Global Security Initiative or the Global Development Initiative for precisely this purpose. We've seen the launching of the Group of Friends on the Global Development Initiative. We've seen Foreign Minister Wang Yi encouraging countries in the global south to sign on to the Global Security Initiative and China's solution to global problems. It's a clear attempt at drawing countries in what's being called by some analysts the strategic middle ground away from the Western sphere of influence. There's also a renewed emphasis on narrative control and the policing of China's red lines overseas. And it's been already announced at the National People's Congress earlier this year that one of the legislative priorities for the future, for this year in particular, for China is going to be to strengthen foreign affairs related laws, as was called. We also perceive a growing willingness by the Chinese leadership to accept some economic and reputational costs in defense of strategic goals and ideological positions. So in order to compete with the West, in order to defend China's ambitions and Xi Jinping's ambitions, economic costs, or at least to a certain extent, are absolutely acceptable. Next slide, please, Miko. This map is just a quick example of what we are seeing that I was mentioning in terms of bloc building. China's new initiatives are targeting regions that are originally already less aligned with the West. On the left, you've got the voting records at the UN General Assembly vote on March 2nd on a resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And on the right-hand side, you have the percentage of countries by region that are members of the Group of Friends of China's Global Development Initiative. And you immediately see that the global south, countries that are already less aligned with the West when it comes to values, principles, and approaches to the global order are the ones that Beijing is targeting the most. Next slide, please, Miko. So what's the impact that all these crises and all these external pressures are having on political stability and on the Chinese leadership and Xi Jinping himself? The answer is, so far, we have seen fairly limited impact. There are, of course, internal debates and disagreements within the party and within the system. We've seen some commentary by certain experts. We've seen some statements and some articles that were out there briefly before they were censored. But generally speaking, public debate on China's global role and geopolitical positioning is tightly controlled and censored. So we don't see a lot of public pushback on Xi Jinping's preferred approach to foreign policy or to any of the global crises that I mentioned. All of these global crises and the Western responses to them, in particular the war in Ukraine, but not exclusively, tend to be spun and framed as evidence that the West is in decline, that China's system is superior, and that Xi Jinping's foreign policy agenda is correct. And of course, the party state's control over the information space in China allows them to push this narrative and this point quite strongly domestically, and of course, internationally as well, by using the propaganda machinery. Nationalism is another force that must be considered because it's being leveraged by the party state to the extent possible to defend the current course, again, domestically and internationally. So what do we expect in terms of outlook? As Nis already mentioned as well, Xi is firmly in control of the military, security, and foreign policy establishment after many years of anti-corruption campaign, of structural reforms, and of placing loyalists in key positions. And his policy priorities have been also codified into laws, regulations, and the party constitution. All of this to mean that we don't expect a major change of course, although we do expect that the leadership will continue to adjust to the changing circumstances while seeking to maintain the overall policy direction. What has to be said, however, is that the situation is dynamic. Many things have happened in the international stage that caught most of us, I believe, by surprise, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine to a number of other global crises, the COVID-19 pandemic. So the situation is dynamic. Things could shift. We would expect that if there were structural and persistent damage to China's economic trajectory and/or political stability domestically as a result of Xi Jinping's chosen path of geopolitical competition and confrontation with the US, this could lead to a loss of faith in the current path, and we could see a bit of a shift. Fundamentally, the party center shows no sign so far of changing course due to all these crises. So the perfect storm metaphor, I believe, at least in my opinion, is not one that necessarily applies here. But we can't discount the fact that Xi Jinping and the leadership may be forced at some point due to circumstances outside of its control to change its policy direction and policy approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have now about 20 minutes for questions. Please do post questions in the chat. I see that colleagues are already responding to questions and comments there. And there's a first question here that I'll send right back to Helena. A question by our colleague Helena Zakharova. Did you observe a shift in China's narrative and behavior towards Russia following Russia's invasion of Ukraine? How has China's position developed and possibly changed in the last couple of months?
Thanks, Benhad, and thank you, Belina. That's a great question. What I would say is that China's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been quite consistent from the start. So there's been adjustment, there's been adaptation, they've modulated the narrative, but at its heart, at the core, the response hasn't shifted all that much, and neither have I seen a massive shift in terms of narrative when it comes to Russia. Maybe the one sort of main moment when I noticed a shift was with the February 4th joint statement between China and Russia, which was the first time that the two sides very openly put out there, black and white on paper, that it wasn't just a bilateral relationship. They also wanted to cooperate in the international space and push back against the Western-dominated global order. Since then, the narrative has been very much about the fact that China and Russia are strategic partners and that they are both sort of together in opposition to the United States, to NATO enlargement, etc. That's not something that has changed all that much over the last few months. If anything, we've seen China adopting an increasingly tougher rhetoric when it comes to Russia and when it comes to the West. We've seen Beijing take up Russian points and sort of Russian phrases and adopt them into their own narrative. So more Chinese echoing of Russia's rhetorical positions. In terms of behavior, very quickly, so we don't take up too much time, Beijing is being quite cautious when it comes to its relations with Russia. We've seen Chinese companies adopt a fairly conservative approach to compliance to avoid being hit by secondary sanctions. Beijing and the Chinese leadership seems to support this approach. So we haven't seen a massive sort of rapprochement between the two over the last couple of months. Rather a continuation. The fact that China and Russia still conducted a joint military exercise in Northeast Asia just a few days ago, around the time of President Biden's visit to the region, which is something that's an annual occurrence, I think says a lot about the fact that nothing much has changed sort of in the foundations of the Chino-Russian relationship, at least for now. Again, situations in flux, and depending on how the war in Ukraine goes, depending on developments in the battlefield, depending on other shifts in the international sphere, this could change going forward. But as of now, I haven't seen any massive adjustments from the Chinese side.
I do realize, as I've just let Bernhard Bartsch, our moderator, back into the room, that we obviously missed him for a second. I hope you don't mind, but he should be back now. And let me just try to take one of the questions that was posted in the chat by Yang Jiang. What do we think is the limit of economic downturn that the Chinese leadership can handle, either in economic growth rate or in unemployment rate? Tough question. I think they're looking at a baseline of above 5% here that needs to be achieved in 2022. They're probably willing to adjust to that. And again, mind you, it is absolutely possible for the Chinese leadership to generate growth to that extent. It is a massive challenge. It creates costs in the long run. But for political purposes, they can achieve those goals. Now, there's a cost in the sense of not being able to achieve those high targets in the future, plus also, as we said, leverage and the distributional effects of all of this. So I would think that for 2022, above 5% is something that is politically still tolerable and doable, but with high costs. Bernhard, we have you back, so we took one question in the meantime. Maybe you want to continue with the moderation now.
Thank you, and sorry about that. There's a couple of questions that I see regarding Taiwan. Maybe, Helena, you want to take a stab at, obviously, the question what all of this means for Taiwan, how China might be tackling that issue.
Happy to. First thing that has to be said when it comes to Taiwan is that there's a lot of factors that come into play here. So we're not going to be able to give a completely definitive answer on sort of when anything may happen or if anything may happen. Regardless, I think what we are seeing, and again, this is something that goes back a few years, is an increasingly aggressive approach and stance towards Taiwan from the Chinese leadership. This is not something that's new. This effectively dates back to when Taiwan was elected and Xi Jinping came to power in China. We've seen more diplomatic pressure on Taiwan, trying to draw diplomatic allies away from Taipei. We've seen more military pressure, increased numbers of flyovers and sorties by the Chinese Air Force, joint drills in the Taiwan Strait and around the island. So the willingness by Beijing and the ambition to reunify with Taiwan and to make progress on that goal of reunification by 2049, the second centenary goal, that is something that's there. And that hasn't changed. And none of these global crises will have shifted the willingness and the ambition to retake Taiwan effectively, and the willingness to resort to force to do so if peaceful means, as Beijing calls them, do not work. I do think, however, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine may have shifted the timeline and may have shifted the plan slightly. Beijing, much like Taiwan and other countries, will have been looking at the developments in Ukraine quite closely, and especially at Western responses, and will be now focused, in particular the PLA, on drawing lessons from what's going on in Ukraine and sort of adapting their own potential scenarios for a Taiwan takeover to minimize potential impact by Western involvement or Western sanctions. Historically, the PLA, the Chinese military, has always taken 2 to 3 years, as far as we can tell, to properly distill lessons from foreign wars and conflicts and integrate them into their own doctrine and strategies. So I would expect potentially a delay in the pre-existing timeline, if one existed, for an attack on Taiwan. But again, the willingness hasn't changed. So I do still expect that Beijing may at some point resort to the use of force to take over Taiwan, if anything, with a slight delay and a slight shift in approach. The one thing I would say is that, again, because the situation in Ukraine is still ongoing, we still don't know what the conclusion will be. This could also shift the perception in Beijing. A Russian victory in Ukraine could embolden the Chinese leadership and could potentially change the cost-benefit analysis. Similarly, a massive Russian defeat, if we ever were to get there, either of the two extremes, could also shift the cost-benefit analysis. So it's something that we're going to have to watch very closely because, again, it's still in flux.
Thank you, Helena. I'll bundle a couple of questions for Nice here. There are questions regarding the speculations about the next generation of leaders. Li Keqiang's role, is he going out? Does he have political freedoms that he's using at the moment? At what point does it make sense to discuss about the lineup for the next Politburo or Standing Committee? I might want to point out here that in our regular publications, Nice and colleagues from the Politics and Society team are actually tracking and portraying potential next leaders. So I'd be interested in your take on that, Nice, and also put that together with a question that's come here by our colleague Henning Hoff from IP on China possibly misreading Europe's attempts at strategic autonomy. Obviously, in this situation, China may be misreading a lot of other international signals. So how would you view China's capacity to actually view what is going on around it in such a very tense situation?
Yeah, thank you. It's extremely hard to say anything about future personnel, and it in a way has become more difficult because these, the horse trading between factions or among factions is much more limited now. So I don't think I can give any predictions of who's going to be in the next Politburo, or I'm sorry, the next Standing Committee. But what we can do is, of course, to look at the structural norms of who's going to be or who needs to be represented, right? So Xi Jinping has mentioned that this time around age will not be the only factor determining the next team. What exactly that means is unclear, but it probably alludes to the rule of you know, if you are 67, you can go another term. If you're 68, you need to go out. If that is true, and it doesn't ignore the age limit, as he maybe has alluded to, that would mean that Li Jianshu can stay. You know, it's a close ally of his. It also means that Han Zheng can stay. So two very important people for him. That's, you know, without going too much into speculation here, there's two interesting scenarios. One is that most people stay in the Standing Committee, and this will be a continuation of the current approach, you know, a stable Xi Jinping dominated policy environment. The other one is that most people go out. There's a lot of people in the Politburo that are 67 or approaching that retirement age, and there's a shift to newer generations. That would be a more interesting scenario. And there is, of course, a couple of candidates that could follow the kind of the old timers. And it would probably lead to a little bit more balance in the terms of policy priorities. One thing that I think is, at least to me, pretty certain is that Li Keqiang doesn't stay. He's also, if I don't misread the regulations, still bound by the two-term limitation, which counts for the premier. So he would need to go and probably be exchanged with someone else. On that second point, I think there's at the moment a real possibility for misreading, or at least for a lack of attention to signals from Europe, from elsewhere, because there seems to be an enormous preoccupation with domestic politics, you know, with politicking, with negotiating future career tracks and so on. So I think these years of change, which we have this year, where important party congresses take place, they are always bound to be an enormously important event for all politicians in leadership positions in China. So I think there's a real danger of China or of Chinese officials currently being too preoccupied with domestic events to really have the capacity to deal with I don't know. There's lots of other options. You know, there's decarbonization. Where does that go this year? There's the shift in the European Union about how to perceive China as a threat, as a rival. I think there's a lot of danger currently that capacities are changing, attention is shifting to domestic, and probably also a lot of people that will know they are going to change office over the next year, already building it in what they expect their future path will be. So tremendously important, I think, to send signals very clearly also from our side right now, and to really try to build contacts and bridges already into the future, not only with the existing officials that are the liaison partners, but also try to locate who are the important places and important people that we probably will have to work with in the future.
Thank you. Let's stay with you for 1 minute. You mentioned where is decarbonization going this year? That actually is a question that came up in the chat, and I know you're looking at sustainability and climate change issues, of course. So where is the climate change agenda going in all of this, and what can we expect from China in that regard?
Well, the good signal is, or the good sign to me, is that I think decarbonization is meant pretty seriously, including by Xi Jinping. He's personally pushing that agenda. So I think long term, I'm cautiously optimistic that decarbonizing goals will actually meet the 2030 carbon peak. China builds a tremendous amount of renewable energy. China already this year has planned to build more than Germany, has doubled the amount of Germany actually in solar capacity. So there's lots of stuff happening. We also know, of course, that coal is still a very important part of the energy system, and that will stay important for the time being because of energy security and supply concerns. Overall, as I said, I think currently, this year, the next year, we will probably not see a lot of movement in terms of more ambitious targets for coal, more ambitious targets for emission in steel and cement and so on, because we need to stabilize, or the government needs to stabilize growth. So that is an inhibitor of fast change for now. But I do assume that from 24, 25, we will see an accelerated path when it comes to decarbonizing industries and energy.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes left, and I think time for 2 more questions. One for Helena, the question that has come up a couple of times here on Australia-China relations, new government in Australia, and the pathway of that relationship that has, of course, many facets to it. Helena, what would be your take and expectation in that regard?
I was just writing that up in the chat, but I'll say it instead. It's a great question. I do expect that with the new government in Australia, an attempt will be made at least at reducing tensions, if not at bringing the relationship fully back on track. I'm not particularly optimistic on this myself. I do think that, again, because of what we all discuss in all of our inputs about how China is increasingly focused on geopolitical competition and on ideology and on maintaining political stability, the fact that Australia is a member of AUKUS and of the Quad, and it's a close ally of the United States, and as such is very much seen as being part of this Western bloc that is intent on containing China. Unless we see a big shift in Australian policies or rhetoric, ideally both, I don't think that the relationship will fundamentally manage to get back on track on this front. It is something that Beijing would like, especially when looking at the issue of energy security that Nice was talking about. Trade between China and Australia, especially when it comes to raw materials, is important for Beijing. But also in light of the tension in the South Pacific over sort of China's security agreements, at least ambition to sign security agreements with a number of islands and Australia's pushback together with the United States, I'm cautiously pessimistic that the relations will actually improve substantially.
Thank you, Helena. And just to advertise this here, Helena talking about security issues, she is the lead author of our regular security and risk tracker, which is one of our members' products, just came out last week. And if you haven't received it, then it probably means that you're not a MERICS member, but this is one of the very good reasons to become one. More information on our website. The last question, the big one for Mikko Hotari, among all the questions that we've had here and unfortunately cannot answer today, but we are answering them in all our other publications step by step. The big question though, what does this all mean for us in Europe, for European China policy?
Well, thank you, Bernhard. Easy question for a Tuesday morning, but I think to summarize the event maybe today, we are looking at a China that is extremely preoccupied with domestic issues first. We have rarely seen the Chinese leadership under such stress over the past years. So we look at uncertainty, unpredictability with regard to policy outcomes, and specifically also the growth outlook. We overall look at a much slower China. China that is willing to pay a pretty high economic price for political priorities. If, and that is likely as of today, Xi Jinping continues to be able to push through with his priorities, the policy package that he stands for, more leftist, statist policies, anti-Westernism, the alignment with Russia, all of these issues are here to stay. There's a risk that these policy priorities will actually be reinforced because of the domestic struggles that they're facing. And I think overall we're looking at a China that clearly has an interest in working more with Europe, but on its own terms, and that not necessarily makes it a defined and easy partner for us as we look forward. So back to you, Bernhard, and thanks everyone for listening in today.
Indeed, thank you very much. There's a lot of open questions, but these questions concern us and we're working on them, and we look forward to discussing them in our publications on our blog in future events. For this morning, thank you very much to Miko and Nils and Helena for sharing your insights this morning. Thank you for everyone for joining, for the very lively discussion in the chat. And we very much look forward to seeing you very soon again at MERICS. Have a good day.